Location, the lab. Quentin only has 24 hours to sell his car. Is that even possible? He goes to Carvana.com.
What is this, a movie trailer?
He ignores the doubters, enters his license plate. Wow, that's a great offer. The car is sold, but will Carvana pick it up in time for...
They'll literally pick it up tomorrow morning. Done with the dramatics?
Car selling in record time.
Save your time. Go to Carvana.com and sell your car today. Pickup fees may apply.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Pope Francis has passed away.
Devo annunciare la morte del nostro Santo Padre Francesco.
That was the announcement from the Vatican confirming the news of the Pope's death at the age of 88, following a series of health struggles. Francis had served as the faith leader to Catholics around the world since 2013, breaking new ground as the first Jesuit to become Pope and as an Argentinian, the first from Latin America. His death has sparked a period of mourning for the faithful and tributes from religious and political leaders around the world. In his 12 years in the Vatican, Francis was seen as a progressive in the role, but also faced conflict within his own church for taking a different approach to the papacy. He left his mark not only on Catholics, but also on Canadians, with a visit here in 2022 to apologize for his church's role in the residential school system. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Emma Anderson, a professor of religious studies at the University of Ottawa, about Pope Francis's legacy, his attempt to modernize some of the views of the Church, his relationship with our Indigenous peoples, what comes next in the process to pick a new Pope, and could a Canadian be in the running? Emma, thanks very much for being here.
My pleasure.
So what is the legacy the Pope leaves behind?
I think the big impact that Pope Francis has had has been one on the imagination of the entire world, both within and outside the Catholic Church. I think people found him uniquely friendly, accessible, just the kind of person you felt like you could meet at a coffee shop or at work or on the street. He really made the papacy, I think, much more accessible. I remember when he came out the very first time after his election, and he wasn't wearing some of the more outlandish parts of the regalia. He had his old kind of slightly cheap-looking glasses and his ordinary black shoes. And I thought, this guy looks like my dad. And then that sense of normalcy, which was abnormal in a pope, continued because he simply said buona sera or good evening. And he brought everything into a more human, relational, and reciprocal kind of engagement. He didn't immediately start blessing everyone. He asked for the prayers of the people for him as he went on to do this difficult task. And that also was something of a breath of fresh air. But at the same time, I think we have to admit that Pope Francis's papacy was divisive. It really thrilled people on the more liberal and progressive side of the political spectrum and theological spectrum, but it really left a lot of conservatives feeling anxious, angry, puzzled, and to some degree disenfranchised by their church. And that's a problem too.
And sorry to jump in here, but just before we jump onto the policy aspects within the Catholic Church, I guess what you're trying to say in terms of how he approached the job, he rejected kind of the fancier, more grandiose aspects of the papacy and tried to really bring it down to earth?
Yeah, I think that's really fair to say because, of course, over the centuries, the papacy has become this incredible kind of gilded, almost like a monarchy. And I mean, in the Middle Ages, the Pope was as powerful as any kind of terrestrial king. He had his own army, he had his own lands. Now, in the 19th century, with Italian reunification, that really got considerably truncated. So now Vatican City, it's very, very easy to kind of go around the outside of the Vatican walls. You can do so in, an hour. But nevertheless, that sense of this kind of medieval kingdom really persists in how the Pope dresses, how the Pope lives. He typically lives in a palace. He wears these sumptuous robes. And Pope Francis really wanted nothing to do with that. He tried to minimize that to the absolute degree he could. So, in just small ways, instead of wearing a pectoral cross that's made of gold and a lot of jewels, he wore one that was made of simple silver. Instead of wearing the mazzata, this beautiful exotic kind of shawl. No, he didn't want that. He didn't want to wear the fancy red slippers. He didn't want to drive in a limousine or a Humvee. He wanted a Fiat. And in this, he was really just trying to be himself. These were tendencies that the Pope had long before he was Pope. He did so as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He liked to cook for himself. He liked to live in a modest space, not a palace. He liked to, make his own meals and meet friends and just live as close to a normal life as he possibly could.
Yeah, and who worked a lot with the poor, and I guess there's that connection there as well that he could bring to the highest position in the Catholic Church.
Well, it's one of those things, if you've seen people living in real poverty, it should probably make you uncomfortable with living this insanely ostentatious life. And apparently, when Pope Francis was first shown the papal apartments, he said, well, you could have 200 people live here, because he was used to the slums of Buenos Aires. And so he thought, no, I'll go and live in Santa Marta, the guest house, and I'll eat in the cafeteria instead of having these special meals made for him all the time. So he really just sort of set an example of more simple and more environmentally sustainable living.
So let's move on then to the policy side of things, because as the leader of an organization like a church, there are, of course, laws and rules that have to be followed and then updated as well. And as a more progressive pope, he kind of faced some conflict there.
Well, I think that part of the reason that Pope Francis was always getting in trouble with more conservative theologians and Catholics in general was because he really saw things more with the eyes of a pastor than with the eyes of a canon lawyer or a theologian. Now, as a Jesuit, of course, he's remarkably well educated. The Jesuits are known for being one of the most intellectually rigorous male Catholic religious orders. But at the same time, his priorities were always people and their feelings and their experiences. And I think really the incident that I remember most from his papacy that really exemplifies this was when he was comforting this young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who had lost his father. And it became very clear this young child had a question for the Pope that he really wanted to ask, but he was really scared to ask. And finally, he decided he would whisper it to the Pope. And it was about the status of his dad. His dad was a non-believer, non-churchgoer, atheist. Would his dad be in heaven with God, is what the little boy wanted to know. And it was masterful to watch the Pope handle this really difficult question, because for him, there really wasn't a question. And he sort of brought the whole gathering along with him in his process of thinking. Having first asked the little boy, is it okay if we talk about this? And commending him for his courage in reaching out. Then he said, why would God want a good man far away from him? He wouldn't. He'd want a good man close to him. And if your dad was a good man, then he's with God now. And the comfort this brought this child, who was in floods of tears, was really unbelievably touching, not just to the people who were there, but to anybody who wants to watch the video on YouTube. You can see this. And it's a beautiful example of really putting people at the heart of the message that I think exemplifies most of his whole papacy.
And what challenges did he run into with the College of Cardinals and more conservative members of the church when it came to the LGBTQ2 plus community?
Well, one thing that we can say that improbably Donald Trump and Pope Francis share, maybe one of the very few things, is they love to talk when they're on airplanes, both of them. And it tends to be when they really kind of let their hair down, such as it is, and let it all hang out and say what they seem to really think. And then often they're in a position where, whoops, they have to walk it back or neutralize or mitigate. And of course, this is where, 1,000 feet up or whatever is where we had Pope Francis say, "Who am I to judge?" Speaking about gay Catholics who want a closer relationship with God. And I think this brings us to another thing that's special about Pope Francis's papacy is that he never was in a sort of thing of, well, I'm up on the moral high ground and everyone else are rolling around in the dirt like sinners. He really sort of keeps this sort of sense of reciprocity and how everyone are sinners in the eyes of God, including people who don't believe in sin and don't believe in God. And I think that's really where the environment comes in. He's like, "Oh, you really think you're so sinless? Look at what we're doing to the world, and look at how all of this environmental degradation and increasing storms and rising seas, look at how that affects the most unfortunate of our brothers and sisters." People in Bangladesh who are, got typhoons and hurricanes and this kind of thing. It's all because of the choices that we're making every day.
And what about gender in the church, with women still not being able to hold the same roles as men?
Yeah, does continue to be a huge problem with Roman Catholicism. And I would say even more so when we look at the makeup of the church, because at least since the late 18th century, women have become more and more at the center and at the heart of the Catholic faith. So it's almost like since the French Revolution, men kind of up and left and made politics their main thing, sort of like you, Cormac, with your political reporting, and left the faith, the family, and assistance in the mass and that kind of thing. That became almost like a feminized religious activity. So to have an all-male hierarchy providing sacraments to a largely female Catholic community, it really does seem very strange. And one would think that the galvanizing words of St. Paul, there's neither male nor female, there's neither slave nor free, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, for all are one in Christ Jesus. You'd think that would mean something. You'd think the fact that everyone's baptized would mean that everyone's equal in the eyes of the church, just like in the eyes of God. But apparently not. And this doesn't seem to be showing any budge room. There was a little bit of wiggle room on divorced and remarried Catholics, a little bit of wiggle room on homosexuality, no wiggle room on female priests. And that's why so many female priests have decided to just up and make their own Catholic churches and minister to their own parishioners outside of the institutional framework because there's no place for them.
More on the big story with Emma Anderson, a professor of religious studies at the University of Ottawa, in just a moment. Emma, before we move on to the process to pick a new pope, can you tell me what was the impact that Pope Francis had on Canada, and more specifically his decision to come here and apologize for the church's role in the residential school system?
Well, this is something that really Canadian Indigenous people have been asking the Pope to do for such a long time. Right from the very beginning of his papacy, there were those knocks at the door. Let us in. We want to talk. We need dialogue on this. We want you to come to Canada. And for such a long time, there was this kind of inability of the Pope to break through to Indigenous people or vice versa. And I think actually the Canadian bishops were not particularly helpful in facilitating this discussion, but that's another story. What I think really changed everything was when Indigenous people just decided to go to Rome and take their case directly to Pope Francis. That seems to have been the best way to get his attention throughout his entire 12 years as Pope. He cannot resist engaging with people in small group or one-on-one situations because his sort of humanity and compassion really come to the forefront and help him to understand the experiences of people that he himself hasn't experienced. And I think after meeting those people and hearing their stories, it really lit a fire under Pope Francis to want to get out here. And so he did. And he did a full visit. I mean, this wasn't touching down in Toronto, splashing around a bit of holy water and jumping back on the plane. I mean, he went pretty much everywhere in the country, not coast to coast to coast, but pretty close. And he went to a lot of places that were very, very special to Indigenous people, and not just Indigenous Catholics, like Lac St. Anne. This has been a focal point for Indigenous spirituality. We don't even know for how long. It's certainly been a place for religious ritual, but also marriage and courtship, also for economic exchange, for the whole Plains peoples. And he went there, and it was a really central part of his apology. And he called his trek a penitential pilgrimage and reiterated his apology numerous times to the different groups that he met. And what I think was special about his apology is it wasn't an apology for the excesses of residential schools, like the sexual abuse or physical abuse or malnutrition. It was an apology for the whole system. He didn't say, oh, well, it would have been okay if there hadn't been X, Y, and Z. He's like, no, you can't really take children away from their parents and try to re-educate them and try to change their belief systems and try to change the language they speak, the clothes they wear, the food they eat, how they live. You just can't do that. There's no justification for breaking that family structure. And I think that's why over and over again in the Pope's trip, he went to places that valorized St. Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary and the grandmother of Jesus, because that's a beautiful example of an extended family. And that's exactly what residential schools broke down, was Indigenous extended families.
And Indigenous groups say this is still not enough, that there is still reconciliation to be had with the Catholic Church. What is left after the passing of Pope Francis to repair that relationship?
I think the biggest outstanding thing at the moment is archival access, because I've had many people contact me to talk about archives and say, how do you get in there? I've got things I want to know. I want to know how, if even searching for lost children, for people who fell by the wayside, for people who don't have death certificates, or just wanting to know more about the experiences of their lost loved ones in these institutions. These institutions should be throwing their doors wide open. In fact, many said they would during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They promised that they would open up their archives, and instead, that hasn't always been the case. I found many times, just as a researcher myself, as an academic, I know my way around archives, both Catholic and secular, and yet we haven't found this openness. Instead, we found, this may this may compromise privacy issues. This may not be open. There's a little bit too much being left to the discretion, I think, of these orders, their archivists, and the institution. And it's not what was promised.
All right. So a lot of work left to do there. So we've talked about the legacy of the Pope on the faithful, on the world, on Canada. Let's talk about what comes next. What are the next steps here for the Catholic Church in choosing a new Pope? How will this unfold from this point on?
Well, there'll be two big kind of ritual moments over the next couple of weeks. On Saturday, there'll be Pope Francis's funeral. That'll be a very big emotional highlight for many Catholics looking to really put this new kind of Franciscan era to bed and look forward to the future of the Catholic Church. Then comes the conclave, and it's fascinating that conclave is taking place at the same time that we're in a Canadian federal election, because both of them are examples of secret ballots and a democratic process, but in quite different ways. So as a Canadian, I get to vote, even though I'm not a cardinal and I'm a woman and I'm not a Catholic. But this is a much smaller election, but it's still an example of democracy in action. So there's 253 cardinals in the College of Cardinals. They're going to convene. They're probably starting now, going to Rome to talk, to confer, to think, to pray. But of that group, only a subset, those under 80 years old, are able to actually vote in the conclave. So there's depends on the numbers you're looking at. Somewhere between 135 and 140 of the cardinals are eligible to vote. So of our 5 gentlemen, our 5 cardinals, we have 4 who are voting members and 1, Marc Ouellet, who's just recently aged out because he's 80 now. He's no longer eligible to vote. But he will still probably be able to participate in ancillary ways in the conclave. So what happens then? All of the voting members of the College of Cardinals are locked inside the Sistine Chapel, and they handwrite out their secret ballots, and these are then read aloud until it becomes clear whether or not someone has reached the 2/3 majority necessary to make a new pope. If they fail, we get black smoke coming out of the little chimney in the Sistine Chapel. If they succeed, we get white smoke, and then a whole new series of rituals start out. First of all, we have the picking of the new papal name, and we have the finding the right size of the outfits. There's 3 sets of papal vestments, one for the more rotund pope, one for the tiny pope, one for the tall pope, right? And so they're fitted, the new pope is fitted with his gear, picks this new name. And these papal names are very important. Right out of the gate, they give you a sense of the pope's priorities. Benedict, of course, hearkening back to Saint Benedict, a very scholastic, monastic, academic kind of papal name. Francis, of course, with its ethos of nature and poverty. So right away, we'll learn a lot about who this new pope is.
Now, when it comes to picking the new pope, what will the cardinals be looking for here? Is it like politics where the person who's been campaigning for a long time might have a good shot? Or is it, are they looking for somebody maybe who is not looking for the glory, but a steady hand at the tiller? Will they go to somebody who is more conservative after years of having a more progressive pope? What could happen?
This is the big unknown, and I don't think, honestly, anybody can know. It's interesting even looking at the booking sites, bookies and whatnot, who are wagering on who's going to be the next pope. It seems like the 2 leading contenders, at least in the popular imagination, are a liberal candidate and a moderate candidate. And then other papabili that are being floated around are on all sorts of different kinds of flavors of conservative. But probably the top 2 in my book are the Filipino Cardinal Tagle. He's been called the Asian Francis. For those who are interested in having the first non-white pope, he is an attractive alternative because he's Asian, but at the same time, he does continue that kind of Franciscan legacy of being more open and more liberal. However, there's others that think that perhaps the sitting Vatican Secretary of State, Parolin, would be a better choice because he might be able to bring together conservative and liberal factions within the church. He's respected. He is a Vatican insider, and yet he was also trusted very much by Pope Francis. So he would be perhaps a good conciliatory, middle-of-the-road figure.
Okay, so it sounds like a Canadian might not be in the running then?
Seems unlikely. We have had Marc Ouellet as a papabili, or a possible pope, during the last 2 papal elections. But the fact that he's now 80 and not able to participate in the voting, it doesn't disqualify him as a possible pope. But there are all those allegations of sexual harassment that sort of continue to linger around him. That's somewhat unfortunate. I think that's kind of put a stop, together with his age, to his possible progression to becoming Canada's first pope.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on all of this.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
That was Emma Anderson, a professor of religious studies at the University of Ottawa, speaking to me about Pope Francis's legacy, his attempts to modernize the church, his impact on Canada, and what comes next in the process to pick a new pope. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other one by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Just please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.